Miss Marple, and the Case of the Stolen Hymnal. Chapter 1. The village of St. Mary Mead Cross was awash in a gentle golden light, the sort that only an early autumn afternoon could bring. The hedgerows blazed with orange and russet, and the narrow lanes bustled with cheerful chatter. Today was the day of the annual choir festival, a modest but beloved tradition where local choirs gathered at St. Mary Mead Church to perform, gossip, and quietly compete for pride more than prizes. Miss Marple, seated near the back of the nave, adjusted her soft grey shawl and smiled politely at Mrs. Weatherby, who bustled past with a tray of buttered scones. Around her, villagers mingled in the pews, exchanging pleasantries laced with undercurrents only someone of keen observation could detect. It was a peaceful gathering outwardly. The vicar, Reverend Harold Peebles, beamed with paternal pride as he supervised the proceedings. His wife, Clara Peebles, flitted between the aisles, checking hymnals and straightening hymn sheets, her brow faintly furrowed in concentration. The festival was not merely a musical affair. It was also an unofficial stage for personal triumphs and long-simmering tensions. Old Mrs. Bletchley, a fiercely competitive soprano from Lower Barton, eyed the younger, prettier Miss Irene Shapcott with a blend of disdain and jealousy. Mr. Lionel Hargreaves, the self-important organist, shuffled his sheet music noisily, making sure everyone knew how essential he was, and young Mr. Arthur Finch, newly returned from London, hovered awkwardly by the vestry, exchanging stiff pleasantries with villagers who remembered him as a barefoot boy with grass-stained knees. Miss Marple, sipping a modest cup of weak tea, let her knitting rest quietly in her lap. Her blue eyes twinkled as she observed the shifting tides of conversation, a tight-lipped handshake here, an over-enthusiastic greeting there. Small signs, to be sure, but they spoke volumes to a mind attuned to human frailty. As the festival drew nearer to its climax, the grand combined choir performance, the air grew heavier. There was a minor flurry of confusion when Miss Shapcott's sheet music was discovered missing, only to be found moments later folded beneath the organ bench. Mr. Hargreaves muttered something about carelessness, loud enough for half the church to hear. A laugh, too shrill to be natural, escaped from Mrs. Weatherby. The vicar called everyone to order. "Now then, page 146 in your hymnals, please. Blessed morning dawns anew. All together." There was a communal rustle as hymnals were opened. Voices rose in harmony, filling the ancient stone nave with rich sound. Yet even in that music, Miss Marple sensed a dissonant undertone. Not in the notes themselves, but in the atmosphere, the way certain glances flickered, the tension coiling beneath the polished civility. It was during the final triumphant chorus that something unusual happened. A sharp clatter rang out from the vestry. Heads turned, a few voices faltered. Reverend Peebles, frowning, gestured discreetly to his wife, who hurried off to investigate. The singing stumbled briefly but recovered, and the hymn ended with a mighty, if slightly ragged, Amen. Mrs. Peebles reappeared, her face pale beneath its powder. She leaned close to her husband and whispered urgently. His expression stiffened. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, clearing his throat, "if you would be so good as to remain seated for a moment." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Miss Marple, still and unassuming in her pew, caught the faintest whiff of scandal on the air. Something had gone wrong, quite wrong. Moments later, Mr. Hargreaves stormed out of the vestry, his arms rigid at his sides. His usually ruddy face was blotched with crimson patches. "An outrage," he barked to no one in particular. "An absolute outrage. What is it, Mrs.?" Weatherby whispered loudly. "What's happened?" The vicar raised a hand. "Please, everyone, please. It appears that one of the parish hymnals has gone missing. An important one. The illuminated hymnal, the original from the 16th century." A gasp rose from the villagers. That hymnal, ancient and beautifully hand-painted, was a cherished heirloom of St. Mary Mead Cross, rarely displayed, always locked safely away. Its loss would be a blow not merely to the church, but to the village's pride itself. The villagers buzzed with outrage and disbelief, but Miss Marple remained silent. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and lowered her gaze to her knitting, her needles still now. Something had begun, and it would not, she thought with a faint inward sigh, end with the mere theft of a book. Chapter 2. The news of the missing hymnal spread through St. Mary Mead Cross faster than the autumn winds. By dusk, the entire village seemed wrapped in an uneasy hush, the kind that made curtains twitch and doors linger a little too long on their hinges. At the Red Fern tea-rooms, clusters of villagers huddled over steaming cups, voices lowered in conspiratorial tones. The theft was an outrage, but more than that, it was an insult. To steal from the church, and during the choir festival no less. It spoke of something dark threading through their tidy, respectable lives. Miss Marple sat quietly at her usual table by the window, her tea untouched. Outside, the last glow of daylight faded, casting long shadows over the village green. She listened without seeming to, her knitting needles clinking softly. "Mark my words," said Mrs. Weatherby, slicing her scone with unnecessary violence. "It was that Arthur Finch, London changes people." Mrs. Hartnell, a stout woman with a voice like a cracked bell, sniffed. "Young Arthur? Nonsense! He's hardly clever enough to steal a plate, let alone a priceless hymnal." A few heads nodded in agreement, but others hesitated. Doubt was already afoot, gnawing at old certainties. Behind the counter, young Daisy Partridge whispered to her mother, "Do you think it could be Mr. Hargreaves? He was awfully red-faced." Mrs. Partridge frowned. "Hargreaves is a pompous fool, but he wouldn't risk his position. He loves that church more than his own house." Miss Marple clicked her needles gently, the rhythm steady, unhurried. She found it curious, the rush to assign guilt before the facts were known. But then, she mused, it was often in the scrambling to cast suspicion elsewhere that true guilt revealed itself. The bell above the door jingled, and Reverend Peebles entered, his hat clutched nervously in his hands. The room fell into an expectant silence. "Good evening," he said, clearing his throat. I just wanted to assure everyone that the authorities have been informed. Inspector Cray will be arriving tomorrow morning from Much Benham to assist." There was a mutter of approval, though some faces tightened. Having a policeman snooping around was hardly welcome, even if it was necessary. "And," continued the vicar, glancing at Miss Marple with a flicker of unease, "I would ask that we refrain from wild speculation. We are all neighbours after all." Miss Marple met his gaze with a gentle, unreadable smile. The vicar flushed and looked away. As he left, Mrs. Weatherby leaned across the table. "Speculation," she whispered fiercely. "What else are we to do? If it wasn't young Arthur or Mr. Hargreaves, then who? No stranger could have slipped in unnoticed, not during the festival. No, Miss Marple said quietly. It would have to be someone very familiar, someone trusted." The words hung in the air like a faint chill. Several villagers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Outside, twilight deepened into full dark. Lamps blinked on behind curtained windows, and the cobbled streets emptied. Only the church stood silent and brooding against the skyline, its weathered stones soaking up the last of the light. Later that evening, back at her neat little cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting abandoned on the side table. She pondered the day's events with careful precision. There were details already pressing at the corners of her mind, small things, but significant. The misplaced sheet music, Mr. Hargreaves' furious outburst, Mrs. Peebles's strangely pale face, and most curious of all, the noise from the vestry, so perfectly timed to the festival's climax. Too perfect. Miss Marple rose, moving to the window. Across the green, the faint glow of the vicarage could be seen through the trees. Lights flickered behind the heavy drapes, shadowy figures passing by. The vicar and his wife, no doubt, wrestling with their own fears. A movement caught her eye, a solitary figure slipping along the hedge toward the church, dark-clad, quick-footed. Miss Marple narrowed her gaze, but made no move to intervene. She merely observed, as was her way, noting the slight limp in the figure's stride. Limping slightly, but moving with familiarity, toward the vestry door. After a moment, the figure disappeared into the gloom. Miss Marple sighed and returned to her chair. There was much more to this theft than hurt pride or village scandal. She could feel it in her bones, a tangle of secrets and grievances wound tight over years, perhaps decades. And as always, it would not stay hidden for long. Not here. Not with human nature being what it was. Chapter 3. Inspector Cray arrived early the next morning, bringing with him a stiff breeze and the faint scent of damp wool. He was a tall, wiry man in his 40s, with a plain face and sharp, restless eyes. His reputation in Much Benham was one of thoroughness, if not imagination. The village gathered around the churchyard like moths to a lamp, casting glances both eager and guilty, as Cray spoke briefly with Reverend Peebles. Then he began his methodical questioning, starting with those who had been nearest the vestry when the theft was discovered. Miss Marple, knitting bag in hand, stood a little apart under the shade of the great yew tree. She watched the inspector work with quiet interest. "Mr. Hargreaves," Cray called. The organist approached, his lips compressed into a tight line. "You were responsible for the music sheets, were you not?" Cray asked briskly. "I was," Hargreaves said stiffly. "But I had no reason to go near the vestry during the performance. I remained at the organ. You were heard to raise your voice afterward. I was angry," Hargreaves snapped. "The loss of that hymnal is a disgrace." Miss Marple noted the defensive flair in his tone. Anger was natural, but there was something a little too eager about it, as though rehearsed. Next came Mrs. Weatherby, who fluttered her handkerchief and insisted she had seen nothing except poor Irene Shapcott dropping her sheet music, an event she recounted with unnecessary relish. When young Arthur Finch was called, a hush fell over the gathering. Arthur approached with an awkward shuffle, his cap twisted between his hands. "You arrived back in St. Mary Mead only last week, Mr. Finch?" Cray asked. "Yes, sir," Arthur said, voice cracking slightly, "and stayed with my aunt, Mrs. Tilling." "And during the festival?" Arthur swallowed hard. I was helping serve tea in the hall next door." Several heads nodded grudging confirmation. Mrs. Tilling, stout and grim, glared at anyone who dared doubt her nephew's honesty. Cray scribbled something in his notebook and waved Arthur away. The questioning continued in this fashion, polite, procedural, seemingly thorough. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle signs the inspector missed. The way Mrs. Peebles avoided looking at her husband, the faint tremor in Daisy Partridge's hand when asked about the vestry keys, the oddly timed cough from Mr. Hargreaves whenever suspicions drifted too near. After an hour, Cray called for the vicar. "Now then, Reverend, about the security of the hymnal?" Peebles' face, already lined with worry, grew more drawn. "The hymnal was kept in the vestry safe," he said. "Only I and Mrs. Peebles have keys, and of course Mr. Hargreaves had access when necessary for festivals. Was the vestry door locked during the performance?" Peebles hesitated. "It should have been. I cannot say for certain." Cray frowned but said nothing more. He instructed the villagers to remain available for further questioning and retreated into the vestry with the vicar. As the crowd dispersed, buzzing like disturbed bees, Miss Marple wandered slowly across the green toward the lich gate. Her knitting hung forgotten at her side. "Miss Marple!" a voice called. It was Daisy Partridge, breathless and pink-faced. She caught up with Miss Marple, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. I didn't say earlier," Daisy whispered, "but last night, after the festival, I saw someone near the church." Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "Someone." "A figure near the vestry door. I couldn't tell who. It was dark. But they limped just a little." Miss Marple gave a small, encouraging nod. "That's very helpful, my dear. You did right to tell me." Daisy's face relaxed into a shy smile, and she hurried away. Miss Marple stood still for a moment longer, absorbing this new detail. A limp, not a dramatic one, but just enough to be noticed by a sharp eye, or missed by a distracted one. It narrowed possibilities considerably. Miss Marple turned back toward her cottage, her mind ticking through the afternoon's observations. She would, of course, speak with Inspector Cray, carefully, but she would also continue her own quiet inquiries. After all, the stolen hymnal was only the surface of the trouble. She had a growing certainty that beneath the theft lay something deeper, older, and far more dangerous than anyone in St. Mary Mead Cross yet suspected, and it would not stay hidden for much longer. Chapter 4. By midday, Inspector Cray had settled on two clear avenues of suspicion. Both, in Miss Marple's view, were a touch too convenient. The first was young Arthur Finch. His recent return from London, combined with his awkwardness and the town's lingering mistrust of big city ways, made him an easy scapegoat. A few voices in the village, emboldened by gossip, even suggested he must be in some sort of financial trouble. A perfect motive for theft. The second was Irene Shapcott, the choir's rising star. It had come to light through Mrs. Weatherby's breathless retelling that Miss Shapcott had once mentioned ambitions to study music professionally, ambitions that would, naturally, require money. Inspector Cray called both Arthur and Irene back to the church vestry for further questioning that afternoon. Miss Marple, on the pretence of bringing an embroidered altar cloth for Mrs. Peebles, was politely but firmly asked to wait outside. She complied with good grace, settling herself on a stone bench near the church porch, her knitting needles flashing in the weak sun. Inside, raised voices drifted faintly through the thick oak doors. "I didn't take it." Arthur's voice cracked. "I don't even know what it's worth." Cray's reply was inaudible, but the gruffness of his tone needed no translation. A few minutes later, Irene Shapcott emerged, her pale face blotchy with suppressed tears. She glanced around, spotted Miss Marple, and hesitated. After a brief internal struggle, she approached. "I suppose," Irene said tightly. "Everyone thinks I did it." Miss Marple looked up, her expression mild. "The village does love its little dramas," she said gently. Irene's shoulders slumped. "I swear I didn't touch that stupid book. I hardly even looked at it when Reverend Peebles showed it to us last Easter." Miss Marple nodded, her hands still moving deftly through loops of soft grey yarn. "Sometimes," she said, "the things we overlook are the ones that matter most." Irene blinked, uncertain whether that was meant to comfort or accuse. Before she could reply, Mrs. Hartnell bustled past, casting a daggered glance at the girl. Miss Marple's sharp old eyes missed nothing. The way Irene stiffened, the way Mrs. Hartnell's lips thinned in satisfaction. Old grudges, perhaps. Miss Marple filed the thought away. That evening at the vicarage, Reverend Peebles and his wife hosted a small meeting for concerned parties, a vague term that somehow included half the village. Miss Marple received a warm but weary invitation and accepted. The drawing-room buzzed with low, fretful conversation. Teacups rattled, biscuits lay untouched on polished trays. Inspector Cray stood near the hearth, arms folded. "As matters stand," he said, "the evidence points strongly toward one of our younger residents. Either Mr. Finch or Miss Shapcott had opportunity, and both may have had motive." A wave of uncomfortable murmurs passed through the room. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze resting lightly on Mrs. Peebles, who sat rigidly beside her husband, her hands clenched so tightly, her knuckles blanched. She was frightened. That much was clear. But was it fear for the village's reputation? Fear of scandal? Or something more personal? Across the room, Mr. Hargreaves cleared his throat loudly. "I still maintain," he said, "that proper locking procedures were not followed. The vicar was negligent." The vicar's face darkened. "I beg your pardon, sir." Miss Marple set down her cup with a gentle clink. "If I may," she said, her voice mild, "perhaps we are all being a little hasty." The room fell silent. Even Inspector Cray turned toward her. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Human nature," she said. "Rarely does the expected thing. A theft committed in plain sight during a crowded festival is a daring act. It suggests either desperation or great confidence." She let that hang in the air. confidence, murmured Mrs. Weatherby, wide-eyed. Meaning, meaning, said Miss Marple, her tone light, that perhaps we should look not for the newcomer or the ambitious youth, but for someone so familiar, so above suspicion, that no one would think to doubt them. There was a long, heavy pause. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, the soft click of needles filling the silence. Across the room, Mrs. Peebles's teacup trembled on its saucer. Mr. Hargreaves stared into the fire, jaw tight, and Daisy Partridge, unnoticed by the elders, slipped quietly out of the room, her face troubled. The meeting dissolved soon after, with polite farewells and forced smiles, but a different kind of unease lingered now, one not directed at easy scapegoats, but turned inward, toward old familiar faces. And that, Miss Marple thought as she buttoned her coat, was where the truth would be found. In the places no one wanted to look. Chapter 5. The morning after the vicarage meeting, St. Mary Mead Cross awoke under a grey sky, the kind that seemed to press down upon the village roofs and make even the cobblestones seem heavier. Miss Marple, ever an early riser, made her way toward the church, under the pretext of returning a borrowed prayer book. In reality, she wished to observe the vestry herself, something that had been gnawing at her since Daisy Partridge's whispered revelation. The church door creaked open with familiar weight. Within, the nave lay cool and still, dust motes spiralling through the muted light. In the vestry, Miss Marple found Reverend Peebles alone, seated at his desk, his fingers steepled against his lips. He looked up, startled. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile, "you've caught me in a moment of reflection." "I won't disturb you long," she said kindly. "I simply wished to return this." She laid the prayer book on the table. Her eyes, however, scanned the room without appearing to. The safe stood against the far wall, its heavy door ajar under Inspector Cray's orders. Inside, various parish items were stacked neatly: silver chalices, aged records, and a few ceremonial books. Nothing seemed out of place, at first. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the hymnals stacked on the shelf beside the safe. Several newer editions lay there, all identical, but tucked near the bottom, almost hidden behind the others, was a worn green-bound book, its spine cracked, its corners softened with age. Curious, she stepped a little closer. "Is this where the hymnals are usually kept, Reverend?" "Yes," Peebles said distractedly, though the illuminated hymnal was always secured in the safe itself. Miss Marple nodded absently, her fingers brushing the green book. It shifted slightly under her touch, and something thin and pale fluttered from its pages to the floor. She bent gracefully and retrieved it. A scrap of paper, no more than an inch across, creased and faintly smudged with ink. Miss Marple read the few visible words: "Corner shelf, second." She tucked the scrap back into the book without comment, smoothing it carefully. "Most orderly," she said pleasantly. Reverend Peebles, oblivious, smiled faintly. "We try our best." Outside the air was brisk and clean. Miss Marple made her way toward the red fern tea rooms, knowing that if gossip had gained any new material, overnight it would be simmering there. Indeed, she had barely settled herself when Mrs. Weatherby swooped in, bursting with news. "Inspector Cray searched Arthur's aunt's house this morning," she said in a stage whisper. "Found nothing, of course. Poor boy looked as if he might faint." "How distressing," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Weatherby lowered her voice further. "Between you and me, I don't believe Arthur capable of stealing anything. He's foolish, yes, but not wicked." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "No," she said, "foolishness and wickedness are quite distinct." Their conversation was interrupted by Daisy Partridge, who had hurried over, pink-cheeked and anxious. "Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "I thought you should know. Mrs. Peebles dismissed me this morning." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "Indeed?" Daisy nodded, biting her lip. She said she needed to manage the house herself for a while. But I think," she hesitated, "think she's afraid. Afraid of what people might find out." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "You have been most helpful, my dear." Daisy's eyes filled with gratitude. As the girl departed, Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer. "What do you think it means, Miss Marple?" But Miss Marple only smiled and changed the subject to Mrs. Weatherby's prized geraniums. There was no need to rush. The village was beginning to show its cracks, and now she had something the others did not. A scrap of a hidden message, tucked away where no one had thought to look. That evening, as dusk fell in thin, misty sheets over the green, Miss Marple sat by her fire, examining the scrap once more under a magnifying glass. Corner shelf, second from bottom, locked. A direction, clearly. But to what? Not the church safe. That had been thoroughly searched. No, this was something more private. Something someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. Miss Marple's mind turned to the vestry again. A corner shelf, a hidden compartment, or perhaps something far more ordinary. Something whose significance lay not in its appearance, but in its contents, and tomorrow, she decided, she would have a careful word with Clara Peebles. The vicar's wife, with her pale face and tightly folded hands, was a woman guarding more than her husband's reputation. Miss Marple felt certain of it, and the truth, she thought as she laid aside the scrap, was very near now, lying quietly, just waiting to be seen. Chapter 6. The next morning, Miss Marple arranged her visit to the vicarage under the modest excuse of bringing some lavender sachets, a small courtesy for Mrs. Peebles, who looked as though she hadn't slept a proper night since the theft. Clara Peebles answered the door, herself. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, managing a strained smile, "do come in." The drawing-room was tidy to a fault, every cushion and ornament meticulously in place, yet there was a tightness to the air, an invisible crackle of tension that no amount of good housekeeping could dispel. Miss Marple accepted a seat and chatted lightly for a few minutes. Flowers, the uncertain weather, the choirs upcoming, practices. Only when the tea was poured and the initial nerves had dulled slightly did she steer the conversation toward more delicate territory. "It must be a dreadful strain," she said kindly, "to bear so much responsibility for the church's treasures." Clara's hand trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "I suppose it is," she admitted, "though Harold, Reverend Peebles, always believed in trusting our congregation." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And you?" A brief silence. "I think," Clara's voice wavered, "I think trusting too easily can be dangerous." Miss Marple gave a soft nod, allowing the words to settle. "And yet she said. "Sometimes it is within our very walls that danger creeps. Familiar faces, old grudges, hidden sins." Clara's face went very still. "You think someone from the village, I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that evil, like mildew, often grows where one least expects it." For a moment, Miss Marple thought Clara might speak, might unburden herself, but the woman only pressed her lips together tightly and reached for her embroidery hoop, signalling the conversation's polite end. Miss Marple rose, thanking her host, and made her way back down Church Lane, her mind ticking steadily. Clara Peebles knew something. Not about the hymnal's immediate theft, perhaps, but something deeper, something older. She wore her fear like an ill-fitting coat, and in Miss Marple's experience, fear was never without cause. That afternoon the villagers gathered once more at the Redfern tea-rooms, drawn as if by instinct to the latest murmurs of scandal. Arthur Finch sat hunched in a corner, his face pale and closed. Daisy Partridge served tea mechanically, her usual brightness dimmed. Mrs. Weatherby, never one to let an opportunity pass, leaned conspiratorially across to Miss Marple. "Have you heard? Inspector Cray found muddy footprints leading up to the vestry." Miss Marple's knitting paused for the briefest moment. "Footprints?" Mrs. Weatherby nodded eagerly. "Small ones. Too small for Arthur, or Mr. Hargreaves for that matter." "Interesting," Miss Marple said softly, though inside she felt a flicker of something sharper. Small footprints, a small figure, and a limp. Later that evening, as dusk began to smother, the village in muted grey, Miss Marple ventured back to the church grounds. She moved quietly through the lich gate, across the green where the mist clung low to the earth. At the vestry door she paused, scanning the ground. It was faint, nearly erased by rain and time, but there it was, a set of prints, narrow, close together. The right one slightly deeper, suggesting favouring of the left foot. A memory stirred of the limping figure she had glimpsed after the festival, and just then a soft sound behind her. Miss Marple turned to see Daisy Partridge, hovering uncertainly at the edge of the green. "I'm sorry," Daisy whispered, wringing her hands. "I shouldn't have followed you, but I needed to talk." Miss Marple motioned her closer. "Go on, dear." Daisy glanced back toward the vicarage, as if fearful of being overheard. "It's Mrs. Peebles," she said in a rush. "She's been hiding letters. I cleaned the study sometimes, and I found a bundle tucked behind the hymnals." "Letters?" Miss Marple prompted. "From someone she didn't want Reverend Peebles to know about. Someone asking for money." Miss Marple's mind sharpened instantly. Blackmail. Of course, not a theft for profit, but a theft born out of desperation, to meet demands, to stave off disgrace. "Can you describe the handwriting?" Miss Marple asked. Daisy frowned, thinking. "Big loops, slanted, untidy, like someone who's clever but careless." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "That's very helpful, my dear." As Daisy slipped away into the mist, Miss Marple stood still for a long moment, breathing in the cool, damp air. The pieces were shifting into place. The stolen hymnal was not the root of the matter, but a symptom of secrets rotting just beneath the village's polished surface. And now, she thought, It was nearly time to draw them all into the light. Chapter 7. The rain returned that night, fine and misty at first, then deepening into a steady, soaking drizzle that darkened the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead Cross and turned the village lanes into slick ribbons of mud. Miss Marple sat by her fire, the scrap of paper from the hymnal resting beside her teacup, when the knock came at her door. Urgent, hurried. She rose immediately. On the doorstep stood Reverend Peebles, his face pale, his clerical collar askew. Rain dripped from the brim of his battered hat. "Miss Marple," he gasped, "you must come at once. Something terrible has happened." Within minutes she was bundled in her mackintosh, following the vicar's clumsy stride down Church Lane towards the parish hall. Inside, villagers clustered in tense knots, whispering. Mrs. Weatherby clutched her shawl as though it were a shield. Mr. Hargreaves, for once, had nothing to say. On the hall's small dais, Inspector Cray stood beside a folding table. Upon it lay a sodden, muddy package, hastily unwrapped to reveal the missing hymnal. Ruined, the once beautiful illuminated pages were stained and torn, the delicate script blurred beyond recognition. A few gold-leaf accents still gleamed feebly, but the binding was split, the cover buckled by water. A gasp rippled through the room. "Found in the mill stream," Cray announced grimly. Tangled in the reeds, the weight of the loss settled heavily over the crowd. It was not simply theft now, it was desecration. Miss Marple moved quietly to the edge of the gathering, observing. Reverend Peebles was ashen. Mrs. Peebles stood stiffly at his side, her lips pressed thin. Mr. Hargreaves's hands were shoved deep into his coat pockets, fists clenched, and Daisy Partridge, poor sweet Daisy, stood half-hidden behind a pillar, her eyes huge with horror. Cray's gaze swept the room. "I want everyone who was near the church yesterday evening to account for their movements," he said sharply. A murmur rose, objections sputtered, but Miss Marple barely listened. She was watching something else, Arthur Finch, trying very hard to edge backward toward the door, away from the attention, away from the hymnal's ruined remains. Miss Marple caught his eye and saw it, not guilt, fear, different beasts entirely. She tucked that observation away. The questioning lasted into the small hours. One by one, villagers offered accounts, most vague, some contradictory. Alibis frayed under scrutiny. When her turn came, Miss Marple offered her movements simply and truthfully, omitting only the knowledge Daisy had shared with her. Knowledge not yet ripe for open discussion. Inspector Cray looked no more enlightened than when he began. At last, exhausted and bitterly disappointed, the villagers drifted away into the rain. Outside, under the dim glow of the parish lantern, Miss Marple fell into step beside Arthur Finch. "You mustn't run, you know," she said softly. Arthur flinched. I wasn't running," he mumbled. Miss Marple gave him a look that made him flush scarlet. "You're frightened," she said, "not because you stole anything, but because you saw something." Arthur stopped dead. The rain whispered around them. He began, then shook his head. "They won't believe me." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple agreed, "but you'll tell me." Slowly, Haltingly, Arthur spoke. He had gone to the church after the festival, he said, out of nerves more than anything, to sit quietly where the choir had sung. It had been dark, and he had heard footsteps, uneven, dragging slightly. Hiding behind a pillar, he had watched a shadowed figure slip into the vestry. "I thought it was Mr. Hargreaves at first," Arthur said, voice shaking. "But then I saw the shoes. The shoes." Arthur nodded miserably. "Small, worn down at the heels, like daisies." Miss Marple absorbed this without comment. "And then?" Arthur hesitated. I left. I didn't want trouble. And now they'll think I'm lying." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his arm. "Not if the truth is handled carefully." Arthur looked at her with a mixture of hope and terror. "Go home, dear boy," she said. "Get some rest." As Arthur stumbled away into the mist, Miss Marple remained by the parish gate, her mind busy. The figure with the limp, the small footprints, the fear in Daisy's eyes. It was not as simple as it appeared. Miss Marple had seen too often that guilt could wear many faces, not only the face of the thief, but that of the blackmailed, the trapped, the desperate. And somewhere at the centre of this web, someone far more calculating was pulling the strings. The ruined hymnal was meant to bury the evidence, but, she thought as she turned back toward home, it had only exposed the rot. And soon, very soon, it would be impossible to hide. Chapter 8. The next morning dawned sharp and cold. The rain gone, but leaving puddles glinting like mirrors across the cobbled streets. St. Mary Mead Cross, exhausted by scandal, moved with subdued purpose. Curtains twitched, heads bent together in hushed conversation, and the church doors remained firmly shut. Miss Marple, however, was quite busy. After breakfast, she wrote 3 polite notes and sent them by hand through young Tommy Blunt, the errand boy. Each note was simple, an invitation to tea at her cottage that afternoon. 1 to Daisy Partridge, 1 to Mrs. Peebles, 1 to Mr. Hargreaves. 3 players, 3 different fears. And when they all arrived, one after another, promptly at 4 o'clock, Miss Marple knew she was nearing the heart of things. The sitting-room was warm and welcoming, the scent of lemon drizzle cake in the air. Miss Marple bustled about, pouring tea and offering plates with the kind of gentle efficiency that disarmed even the most anxious guest. "Such a pity," she said lightly as she sliced the cake, "about the poor hymnal. All that history, lost to damp and carelessness." Mr. Hargreaves muttered into his cup. Mrs. Peebles sat stiffly, her fingers knotted in her lap. Daisy, pale and wide-eyed, barely touched her tea. Miss Marple went on, as if speaking idly. "I often think," she said, "that when one thing goes missing, other things tend to be missing too. Letters, for instance. There was a distinct twitch from Mrs. Peebles." Daisy dropped her teaspoon with a clatter. Mr. Hargreaves scowled. "Letters?" he said gruffly. "What letters?" "Oh, old ones," Miss Marple said airily. "Tucked away, forgotten. Sometimes with things hidden inside. Directions, little notes, secrets even." The silence that followed was rich, textured with strain. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside, her eyes very mild. "You see, the thing about blackmail," she said, "is that it rarely ends with one payment, There's always another demand, another threat. Mrs. Peebles made a strangled sound, half sob, half gasp, and Daisy, trembling now, whispered, "I didn't mean to do wrong. I didn't know what else to do." Mr. Hargreaves turned sharply toward her. "You!" he barked. "What have you—" Miss Marple raised one placid hand. "Let's be very clear," she said, voice gentle but firm. "Daisy did not steal the hymnal." The girl sobbed openly now, clutching a crumpled handkerchief. I only took the letter from Mrs. Peebles's desk. I thought it said there was money hidden, instructions. I thought if I found it, I could make it stop. The blackmail." Mrs. Peebles pressed a hand to her mouth, her face grey. "And the hymnal?" Mr. Hargreaves demanded. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, softly. "The hymnal," she said, "was taken by someone who needed a distraction. Someone who knew the theft would mask another far quieter crime." She turned her gaze on Mr. Hargreaves. "You, sir." The organist stiffened, red climbing into his cheeks. "You had access," Miss Marple said. "You had the authority to move about unnoticed during the festival. You staged the vestry noise to draw attention, snatched the hymnal during the confusion, and later, when you realized the investigation was growing too intense, you destroyed it to cover your tracks." Mr. Hargreaves's mouth worked, but no sound emerged. "And why?" Miss Marple continued calmly. "Because you discovered Mrs. Peebles's letters while nosing through the vestry records. You saw an opportunity to extract a little money for yourself." Inspector Cray, who had been sitting quietly in the corner at Miss Marple's request, now rose. "Enough," he said curtly. "We'll hear the rest of it at the station." Mr. Hargreaves, face blotched and furious, surged to his feet, but there was no fight left in him. Cray took his arm firmly and led him from the room. The door closed. Silence stretched. Mrs. Peebles at last spoke, her voice no louder than a breath. "I didn't know what to do. They said they would tell lies about Harold, about the church. I thought if I paid once, just once—" Miss Marple moved to her side and pressed her hand gently. "Desperation leads to poor bargains, my dear." Daisy, tearful but calmer, whispered, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Peebles. I didn't want to hurt you." The vicar's wife managed a faint, broken smile. "You didn't," she said. "You tried to help, in your way." Miss Marple refilled their teacups, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that brought comfort, not command. Outside, the mist lifted slightly from the village green, the old stones of St. Mary Mead Cross gleaming damply in the tentative light. Inside, at least, a kind of peace began to settle. The truth, painful though it was, had been dragged into daylight at last, and no lies could flourish there any more. Chapter 9. 2 days later, a modest gathering assembled in the vicarage's drawing-room, this time not for suspicion or accusation, but for truth. Inspector Cray stood stiffly near the hearth, his notebook tucked under one arm. Mrs. Peebles sat composed but pale, her husband close beside her. Daisy Partridge fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. A few of the more persistent villagers, Mrs. Weatherby, Mrs. Hartnell, had been allowed to attend, ostensibly as witnesses. At the centre of it all sat Miss Marple, as neat and unassuming as ever, her knitting bag resting quietly at her feet. She cleared her throat softly. "I thought," she said with a pleasant smile, "it might be helpful to explain how everything fits together." The room quieted instantly, expectant. Miss Marple folded her hands. "First," she said, "the matter of the stolen hymnal. It was never the primary goal. Rather, it was used as a diversion to mask the theft of certain letters hidden among the church papers." She glanced at Mrs. Peebles, who bowed her head slightly. "The letters," Miss Marple continued, "contained a blackmailer's threats. Mr. Hargreaves, upon discovering them, seized the opportunity to pressure Mrs. Peebles for money. To distract attention from the theft, and to cover his later fears, when matters escalated, he stole the illuminated hymnal during the choir festival, when movement through the church was chaotic and overlooked." Mrs. Weatherby gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Mr. Hartnell muttered under his breath. Having realized that the theft risked closer scrutiny than he anticipated, Miss Marple said, "Mr. Hargreaves disposed of the hymnal by tossing it into the mill stream, hoping its recovery would seem accidental, perhaps even absolving himself by implying careless loss." Inspector Cray nodded grimly. "But why involve poor Daisy?" Mrs. Hartnell blurted. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, Daisy's part was quite different. Driven by loyalty and a desire to protect Mrs. Peebles, she discovered one of the blackmailers, hidden notes, and attempted to retrieve evidence that might shield her mistress. In doing so, she feared she had implicated herself when the hymnal's disappearance came to light." Daisy flushed but lifted her chin bravely. "And Arthur Finch?" Mrs. Weatherby demanded. "What about him?" "Arthur," Miss Marple said gently, "was guilty only of cowardice. He witnessed a figure near the vestry that night, but, fearing suspicion would fall on him due to his recent return and outsider status, chose silence. His fear grew when the hymnal was found destroyed, leading him to attempt to distance himself even further." A long, heavy pause followed. In it, the pieces settled into place with a kind of inevitable gravity. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, looping a soft strand of grey wool around her needle. "The theft," she said, her tone light but firm, "was born not of greed, but of desperation, and then of opportunity. Small motives lead to large consequences." Mrs. Peebles raised her gaze at last. "And the letters?" "They will be turned over to Inspector Cray," Miss Marple said, "with discretion. The blackmailer, it seems, was a distant cousin long presumed dead, a minor scandal from many years ago. With Mr. Hargreaves' confession, there will be no further threat." Mrs. Peebles sagged slightly with relief. Inspector Cray stepped forward. "I'll be handling the rest officially," he said, "but I'll note for the record that without Miss Marple's careful observation, we might still be chasing shadows." Marple blushed faintly, as if surprised by the praise. "I find," she said modestly, "that people reveal themselves if you let them. The things they say, and more importantly, the things they don't." She rose, gathering her bag. "If you'll excuse me," she said, "I believe my roses need attending." And with that, she slipped quietly from the room, leaving the others to absorb the truth she had so gently, but so unerringly, unveiled. Outside, the mist had finally lifted from St. Mary Mead Cross. The village lay beneath a bright, uncertain sky, as though not quite sure whether to bask or to blush. Miss Marple walked slowly along Church Lane, her steps light, her heart thoughtful the stolen hymnal could never be restored. But the village's sense of itself, that fragile, vital web of trust and understanding, might in time heal, though she knew better than most that human nature would always nurture its secrets. And somewhere, some day, another shadow would creep across some sunlit green. But for now, the truth had been dragged into the light, and that, Miss Marple thought as she bent to pluck a stray weed from her garden path, would have to be enough. Chapter 10. The afternoon sun warmed the garden, casting long shadows across the neat rows of Miss Marple's flowers. A faint breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree, and the air was filled with the peaceful hum of summer beginning to edge into autumn. Miss Marple sat on her garden bench, her knitting needles poised in the quiet rhythm of a task that required no more attention than a passing thought. Beside her lay the now complete skein of yarn, the last stitch drawn with a satisfaction only the well-accomplished task can bring. But though her hands were busy, her mind had already turned toward the puzzle she had solved. She thought back over the clues, each one falling into place like pieces of a complex puzzle. The story of the stolen hymnal was complete, and though the outcome was clear, the journey from confusion to clarity had been anything but simple. The first clue had been the hymnal itself, stolen in plain sight during the choir festival. The Kershurers, disruption of the event with its cacophony of voices and the distracting performance, had provided an ideal cover. The idea of a theft in such an open space, however, made everyone overlook the possibility of a more subtle crime. Then there was the matter of the vestry. Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to it early on, not by the obvious trail of clues, but by the hidden detail. The overlooked book tucked away behind the hymnals. The scrap of paper tucked inside had been the key that unlocked everything. It was small, barely noticeable, but it pointed to a deeper purpose behind the theft. When she had seen the muddy footprints by the vestry door, narrow, small, and imperfectly formed, the realization began to dawn. Someone had been trying to cover their tracks, someone who had access, who knew the church and its routines well enough to move about unseen. A figure with a limp, too, which had been mentioned by Arthur Finch, but not connected to the crime. And then Daisy Partridge's quiet confession had revealed more than Miss Marple could have guessed. The girl had found one of the letters, the one that had slipped from Mrs. Peebles's desk, and out of fear for her mistress, had sought to prevent a deeper scandal. But that fear had tangled her deeper into the web of suspicion, leading her to believe she was complicit in something far more sinister than she had originally imagined. The most telling clue, however, had been the blackmail. The letters Mrs. Peebles had kept hidden spoke of an old scandal, a long-buried secret, and the threats that had been made against the vicar's reputation. Those threats, Miss Marple knew, had driven Mrs. Peebles to make a rash decision. But in the end, the crime was not about a hymnal. It was about fear, desperation, and the lengths one would go to protect a secret. Then there was Mr. Hargreaves. He had been the most obvious suspect from the beginning, yet Miss Marple knew better than to rush to conclusions. He had attempted to cover his tracks by disposing of the hymnal, thinking the village would quickly forget it. But he had underestimated Miss Marple's methodical observation. She had been right to trust her instincts. Mr. Hargreaves had discovered the letters first, seen the opportunity, and then acted on his greed. His destruction of the hymnal was not an act of carelessness, but a calculated move to erase the evidence of his involvement. The confession had come slowly, but once the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, there was little he could do to deny it. Now, sitting quietly in her garden, Miss Marple thought back on the people who had been caught in this tangle of secrets. Arthur Finch, though innocent of any crime, had been drawn into the situation by his own guilt over his silence. Daisy Partridge had feared the worst and tried to cover up what she thought was her mistake. Mrs. Peebles, trapped by a past she had never fully acknowledged, had resorted to a desperate action to preserve her husband's dignity. And as for Mr. Hargreaves, his greed had led him down a path from which there was no return. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside and stood, her hands resting lightly on the bench. The truth had been uncovered, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through quiet observation, the patience to listen, and the understanding of human nature's many facets. She smiled to herself. It was all quite simple, really. The stolen hymnal had been the catalyst, but the real crime lay in the secrets people were willing to protect, no matter the cost. It had taken only the smallest of clues to unravel the tangled threads. And now, with the mystery laid bare and the suspects dealt with, Miss Marple could return to her quiet life. Until, of course, the next mystery beckoned, as it inevitably would. For human nature was full of hidden truths, and Miss Marple knew that some secrets could never be completely buried. Chapter 11. The village of St. Mary Mead Cross, though often a place where time seemed to slow, had recently undergone a transformation. The weeks following the revelation of the stolen hymnal had been filled with a strange quiet, a relief that hung like a fog over the cobbled streets, softening the sharp edges of suspicion and fear. Miss Marple, as always, resumed her routine. Her mornings were filled with knitting, her afternoons with quiet walks, and the occasional tea with friends. Yet even in her small corner of the world, the ripples of the mystery continued to be felt. At the Red Fern Tea Rooms, Mrs. Weatherby discussed the affair with an enthusiasm that nearly turned the air thick with gossip. I suppose we can all agree, Miss Marple, that it was the most surprising end to such a fuss, Mrs. Weatherby said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper as she leaned across the table toward Miss Marple. I do declare I never thought it would be Mr. Hargreaves. And to think it was all about that horrid little secret he uncovered. Miss Marple smiled politely, sipping her tea, though the satisfaction of the resolution was still too fresh for her to openly relish the praise. Yes, she said softly. It was a peculiar thing, wasn't it? How often the most visible culprit turns out to be the least culpable, and the truth lies hidden under layers we would never expect. Mrs. Weatherby, eager to continue her recounting of the events, didn't notice the note of quiet reflection in Miss Marple's voice. And dear Mrs. Peebles, Mrs. Weatherby continued, I must say I pity her. To think she was under such pressure, all for those letters. It's no wonder she was so nervous. I suppose we'll never fully understand how far some people will go to protect their reputations. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, her tone thoughtful. People are capable of strange things when faced with their own fears. As Mrs. Weatherby moved on to discussing the state of the village gardens, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the quiet aftermath of the investigation. The villagers had returned to their daily routines, and life, as it often did after a scandal, began to settle once more, but not entirely without consequence. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Peebles at the vicarage, having received an invitation to come for tea. The invitation had been a quiet gesture, not of formality, but of gratitude, and Miss Marple had accepted with the same gentle acknowledgment she had always given. The vicar's wife, though looking a bit more composed than before, still carried the weight of what had occurred. Her hands, once tightly clasped, were now able to hold the teacup with only a slight tremor. "I still don't know what to say," Mrs. Peebles admitted, her voice low. "Everything feels changed somehow." Miss Marple sat down opposite her, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Change often comes after the truth has been uncovered," she said, her voice gentle. "But sometimes the change is a necessary one." Mrs. Peebles sighed, her eyes drifting to the window where the garden lay in peaceful disarray. "I never imagined it would end like this," she confessed, her gaze distant. "I thought I could keep it hidden. All those years, I never thought it would come to this. I just wanted to protect Harold. And now—" She trailed off, as if the words no longer carried meaning. "You did what you thought was best at the time," Miss Marple said quietly. "But in the end, the truth always finds a way to emerge. It cannot be hidden forever." There was a long pause before Mrs. Peebles nodded slowly, her eyes heavy with unspoken burdens. "I know," she whispered. "I know." Later that evening, after tea had been served and a few more words had been exchanged, Miss Marple took her leave. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, she found her thoughts once more lingering on the complexity of human nature, the blackmail, the fear, the desperate choices. All of it was, in the end, a reflection of the darkness and light that lay within everyone. As she made her way back along the village lanes, her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice calling her name. Turning, Miss Marple saw Daisy Partridge standing on the corner, holding a small bundle of flowers in her hands. "Miss Marple," Daisy said, hesitantly stepping toward her, "I just wanted to thank you again for everything." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You've shown great courage, Daisy. It's not easy to face one's mistakes, but you did." Daisy's eyes filled with gratitude as she looked down at the flowers. "It was all so confusing," Daisy said quietly. "But I'll try to do better, I promise." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze soft. "You will. I'm sure of it." As Daisy walked away, Miss Marple watched her disappear into the fading light, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a case resolved, a mystery unravelled, and the truth finally allowed to breathe. The village was moving on, as villages do, but there was a certain peace to be found in the knowledge that no secrets remained buried for long. Chapter 12. The days that followed the resolution of the case were marked by a quiet peace in St. Mary Mead Cross. The village, which had once been so full of whispered suspicions and anxious glances, now seemed to settle back into its rhythm as though the storm had never come. Miss Marple, as always, kept herself busy with her simple routines. Her mornings were filled with knitting, her afternoons with walks around the village lanes, and the occasional tea with neighbours. life had returned to its normal pace, a normalcy that always felt like a balm after the chaos of a mystery unravelled. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the hills and the last of the summer warmth lingered in the air, Miss Marple sat on her garden bench, a book of poems open in her lap. The wind, gentle and steady, stirred the leaves on the old oak tree. In the distance, the bell tower of St. Mary Mead Church chimed, its deep toll ringing out across the valley. It was a sound Miss Marple had grown used to, a sound that always seemed to signal a fresh beginning after every end. Miss Marple's thoughts wandered back to the case, to the people involved, to the layers of human nature that had woven themselves into the story. At the heart of the mystery had been the stolen hymnal, a seemingly trivial object that had, in the end, been the key to revealing so much more. But what struck Miss Marple most were the decisions people had made, decisions born out of fear, loyalty, and the desire to protect what they held dear. She thought of Mrs. Peebles, still shaken but slowly recovering, as she confronted the guilt of hiding the blackmail for so long. She thought of Daisy Partridge, who had struggled with her own sense of loyalty and guilt, yet had found the courage to speak up when it mattered most. Even Mr. Hargreaves, though driven by greed and fear, had been unmasked for what he was, a man whose desire for power and control had blinded him to the consequences of his actions. And then there was Arthur Finch, a young man who, in his innocence, had found himself caught in the web of others' mistakes. His fear of being judged had nearly kept him from doing what was right, but in the end he had found his courage. Miss Marple smiled quietly, for she knew that courage had come not in the form of a grand gesture, but in the decision to stand by the truth. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Miss Marple rose slowly, setting her book aside, and made her way to answer. Daisy Partridge stood at the threshold, holding a small bouquet of flowers. Her face, though still youthful and unburdened, carried the weight of someone who had learned something important in a short time. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Daisy said hesitantly. I thought you might like these." Miss Marple smiled warmly, accepting the flowers. "How thoughtful of you, Daisy. Please, come in." They sat in the cosy sitting room, the warm afternoon sun spilling through the windows. Daisy glanced nervously at Miss Marple, her hands still clutching the hem of her dress. "I've been thinking about everything," Daisy said softly, "about the way I acted and what I thought was the right thing to do. I didn't know what to do at first, but you were right. It was all about the truth. I was just scared." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but firm. "It's never easy, Daisy. The truth often comes at a cost, but it is the only thing that frees us in the end." Daisy paused for a moment, then spoke with a quiet conviction. "I'm going to leave the village. I think I need to find my own way. I've been living in fear for too long, and I want to make a fresh start. But I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple, for showing me what real courage is." Miss Marple's smile softened. "I think you'll find your way, Daisy. Sometimes it takes leaving the past behind to see the future more clearly." The young girl rose, her shoulders squared with newfound resolve. "Thank you," Daisy said once more, before turning to leave. Miss Marple watched her go, her heart light with a quiet satisfaction. For some, the case had been an end. but for others it had been a beginning. A new chapter in their lives born out of their choices and the lessons learned. As the door clicked shut behind Daisy, Miss Marple returned to her garden bench. The late afternoon light was softening, the air growing cooler. A lone bird called from the tree above her, and for a moment the world seemed at peace. Her thoughts turned inward once again, and she realized that, though the case was resolved, the work of understanding the complexities of human nature never truly ended. Life, with all its trials, mistakes, and small triumphs, would continue to offer new mysteries to solve. And Miss Marple, content as ever, would be ready, for there was always another story waiting, and always a truth to uncover. End of chapter 12. End of the case of the Stolen Hymnal.